So, hello friends, today we will be discussing T S Eliot as a critic. T S Eliot, as we know, he is a poet critic. He belongs to the long line of poet critics in English like Matthew Arnold, John Dryden, and even we have Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It is interesting that in English we have great critics who are great creative writers also. Anyway, we will have a brief look at some of the important literary works of Eliot. Coming to his literary works, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, The Wasteland, published in 1922, the most important of his poems, and Four Quartets. So, these I have listed out only some of his works. We have other great works also, and all of Eliot's works are considered as masterpieces of modernism. Another genre which Eliot attempted is poetic drama or the verse drama which was not that much popular after the 17th century. Anyway, in the 20th century, Eliot along with Christopher Fry tried to revive poetic drama, but their attempt was not much successful. Okay, so important of his poetic dramas: Murder in the Cathedral, The Confidential Clerk, Cocktail Party, Family Reunion, and we have some more dramas also. Anyway, Murder in the Cathedral is the most popular of Eliot's poetic dramas. Eliot tries to include the elements of Greek theatre in his poetic dramas, but his other dramas like The Confidential Clerk, The Family Reunion, which focuses on contemporary events or contemporary life, proved to be less successful. Now, let us look at the criticism of T S Eliot. So, Eliot's criticism can be categorized into two: essays dealing with the function, the role and function of criticism, and essays on individual authors and poets. I have listed out some of the important essays of Eliot. Anyway, Eliot has published a number of important critical works like The Sacred Wood, Homage to John Dryden, Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism. So, these are some of the important works, Elizabethan essays. So, these works are collections of his essays. Anyway, these are some of the popular essays of Eliot: Tradition and Individual Talent, his unofficial critical manifesto; Poetry and Drama, Function of Criticism; and English Metaphysical Poets. The critical stand of T S Eliot: in his preface to the work for Lancelot Andrewes, he openly declared himself as a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and an Anglo-Catholic in religion. This very statement proves T S Eliot to be a conservative or an ultra-conservative in outlook, and it evoked protests from literary circles and from general circles. So, he is first and last a classicist in literature, and these are his stands on politics and religion. So, for Eliot, politics and religion formed indistinguishable part of his works, as it is evident from his important works, important literary as well as critical works. As a classicist, he aimed at forming an order. There was a sort of reaction against the romanticism of the 19th century, and with the emergence of Eliot into the critical scene, that reaction gained momentum. Eliot proved to be the supreme of modernist, and most of Eliot's critical tenets proved to be against the romantic tendencies of the previous age. So, Eliot has summed up the important roles and functions of a critic in his important critical essays. We are summing up some of the main points here. The first one: a critic should have a highly developed sense of fact. For a true critic should possess a highly developed sense of fact. So, by the sense of fact, Eliot points out that in order to judge, in order to evaluate a work, a critic has to focus not on biographical details or on socio-economic conditions of the writer's period, but he should have an idea regarding the techniques employed in that work, the setting of that work. So here we can find a correlation between Eliot and the new critics of the 20th century. Okay, a critic should be a man of immense scholarship. Okay, he should have highly developed sense of facts. This very idea is summed up in Eliot's own words. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not on the poet but upon poetry. Okay, the poet has to have that sense of fact. He should have the idea regarding the technical features of the work, and Eliot upholds Aristotle as the ideal critic, and he wants the critic to be objective. So here Eliot is trying to raise criticism to the pedestal of science. Okay, he is trying to equate criticism with science. Like science, criticism should have that objectivity. The second point, the critic should have a highly developed sense of tradition. This tradition we will discuss in the later part of this lecture as we discuss tradition and individual talent. Anyway, by tradition, Eliot points out the tradition not only of England, not only of the poet's own country, but the entire European tradition starting from Homer to the present day. So the critic should have that sense of tradition, and it is said that critic has a role to review the past of literature and set the poets and the poems in order. We can find this statement absolutely correct in the case of T S Eliot. He revived the metaphysical poets in the 20th century, and with his essay, with the publication of the essay The Metaphysical Poets, readers were interested in metaphysical poetry. There was a revival of metaphysical poetry in the 20th century, and similarly his ideas, his discussion of Dante generated interest for the readers in the Middle Ages. The next point, comparison and analysis. So the idea behind criticism, or the role of criticism, is to elucidate a work of art. For that, the critic uses comparison and analysis. So the role of a critic is not to interpret a work of art. So Eliot believes that interpretation will result in generating very bad taste. He accuses Coleridge as well as Goethe as interpreters, and they are very bad critics in the words of Eliot, because they corrupted public taste by interpretation. So as stated earlier, the critic is having a highly developed sense of fact. So he has to place these facts before the reader and allow them to form their own judgment. Okay, it is not the duty of a critic to provide judgment on a work of art. The critic simply places before the reader the facts, and the readers can the readers can have their own conclusions regarding a work of art. Okay, this is Eliot's concept of comparison and analysis. The next point, educate the taste of the people. So as a classicist, Eliot is trying to correct the taste of readers. He is trying to educate the readers to build up a literary taste so that they will be able to realize good works and bad works. They will be able to identify which work is good and which is bad. Here we can find Eliot turning out to be didactic. Eliot's essay, The Metaphysical Poets. So the Metaphysical Poets is a review that Eliot gave for J.C. Grierson's work Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century. So Eliot published it as a review, but later it proved to be a very important document in English literary criticism. So Eliot was focusing on the term metaphysical. So we know metaphysical was used as a term, and it was to an extent considered derogatory, and it pointed to a group of poets who deviated from the mainstream of English poetry, and these metaphysical poets were not much favored in the 18th and 19th centuries. Eliot in the 20th century is trying to make a revival of these poets. So before going into Eliot's essay, we briefly discuss metaphysical poetry. So metaphysical poets belonged to the 17th century. They were headed by John Donne, and they were a group of poets: Abraham Cowley, Henry Vaughan, then Herbert, Andrew Marvell, etc. And these poets were headed by Donne, and the metaphysical poets modeled their poems on the style of John Donne. So as we know, this poetry was a sort of deviation from the mainstream poetry of the 16th and 17th centuries. They were entirely different from the mellifluous lines or the mellifluous poetry that was provided by Spenser and Shakespeare. These poets made use of abrupt openings. Their poetry proved to be shocking. It was cynical. They made use of syllogism, wordplay, puns, and even the one particular quality of metaphysical poetry is that they made use of conceits. Okay, conceits. We'll discuss a conceit in detail. So these are the words of Helen Gardner regarding what is a conceit. A conceit is a comparison, but it is not an ordinary comparison. A comparison becomes a conceit when we are aware of that unfamiliarity. Okay, comparison becomes a conceit when we are made to concede likeness while being strongly conscious of its unlikeness. So we are aware that these two things cannot be compared. So dissimilar images are brought into comparison. So take two instances from John Donne's poems. One is from A Valediction Forbidding Morning, where we have two lovers. Two lovers are staying apart, okay, and they are compared to the legs of a compass. Another instance is from Donne's own poem, The Flea, where a lover is appealing to his beloved to have sexual union with her, but she is not ready for it, and he brings in the image of a flea. Okay, the flea has bitten the poet, the flea has bitten his lover, his beloved, and the poet tells his lover, okay, our blood is already united in the intestine of that flea, so why are you still denying me sexual favors? So here Donne makes use of dissimilar images to convey his point. The metaphysical poets, in spite of their novelty, failed to create an impression in the later centuries. The important critics of that period disregarded them. They considered, even Dr. Johnson quoted regarding metaphysical poets, they are men of learning. The metaphysical poets are men of learning, and their whole endeavor in their works is to exhibit their learning. And Dr. Johnson, in his Lives of Poets, and Life of Poets is a work of it's a collection of 52 poets, and in his Life of Cowley, Life of Abraham Cowley, one of the famous metaphysical poets, he describes metaphysical poetry as heterogeneous ideas yoked together by violence. Okay, heterogeneous ideas yoked together by violence. So heterogeneous, they are dissimilar. Okay, their dissimilar ideas are brought together by violence. The poets, these metaphysical poets, they are not able to unite them, they are not able to fuse them into an organic whole. Okay, so these ideas are simply violently put together, and the reader or the audience may find it difficult to enjoy such such an image or such a symbol that they make use of in their works. So that was Dr. Johnson's criticism regarding metaphysical poets, and Dr. Johnson claims that these poets are very much analytic, and they obviously are men of learning. They are analytic and they are giving too much emphasis for certain emotions. And Johnson even claims that nature and art are ransacked for illustrations in this metaphysical poetry. So, and the metaphysicals fell out of favor for the next 2 centuries, in the 18th and 19th, and in the 20th century T S Eliot is trying to revive metaphysical poets, and he tries to define metaphysical poetry, and Eliot definitely focuses on Johnson's criticism of metaphysical poets. Johnson claimed that heterogeneous ideas are yoked together by violence. Eliot is of the point of view bringing together heterogeneous ideas and unifying them is not something new in poetry. It has happened across the ages. Great poets were capable of doing it. And so it is not anything unnatural, it is something natural in poetry, and great poets and dramatists possessed that ability of fusing together heterogeneous ideas. So for that particular act, Eliot uses a term, unification of sensibility. Unification of sensibility. It was for the first time that Eliot is using this term, or criticism is coming across such a term, unification of sensibility. So Eliot is of the point of view that the great Elizabethans, the great Elizabethan and Jacobean dramatists possessed this particular ability, the unification of sensibility. It is they had by sensibility, Eliot refers to the faculty of mind which can amalgamate and unite thought and feeling. So the great Elizabethans possessed it, and definitely the metaphysicals also is having that. They are the successors of these Elizabethans, and they possessed. The metaphysicals were men of learning. They thought, they were about to feel, and by the possession of this unification of sensibility, they were able to amalgamate the thought and feeling into a single organic whole. That is the success of these metaphysical poets, and Eliot praises these metaphysical poets. So, and he considers that the poets in the modern age are also like the metaphysicals. They are able to bring together heterogeneous ideas. They are able, not like Dr. Johnson, what Dr. Johnson said, they are not bringing together heterogeneous ideas and yoking them together, but they possess that particular sensibility to fuse them into an organic. And Eliot coins the next term, dissociation of sensibility. Something opposite to the previous term he coined, unification of sensibility. So dissociation of sensibility. So the metaphysical poets were in possession of unification of sensibility, but after metaphysicals, that synthetic faculty was lost. We have Dryden, we have Milton, and Eliot is not in favor of these poets, John Dryden and John Milton, and he claims that these poets had a denigrating influence on poetry, and Eliot claims that the poets of the 18th and the 19th centuries lacked that unification of sensibility. So that particular faculty was lost and a dissociation of sensibility set in. The poets of the 18th century, we know 18th century is the Augustan age, the age of prose and reason, and it was prose that predominated the 18th century, and definitely the decline in poetry is compensated by the rise in prose writings. So Eliot is of the point of view, the poets of the 18th century, they were intellectuals, they thought a lot, they thought, but they were not able to feel. So it was intellectual poetry that dominated the 18th century, okay, like poets like even Dr. Johnson, Dryden, Alexander Pope and like. And in the 19th century we have the Romantics. In the first half of the 19th century we have the romantic poets. These romantic poets gave emphasis for feeling, so they felt but they did not think, and that poetry also lacked that unification of sensibility. Coming to the Victorian age, we know it was a period of Victorian dilemma, and we have the major poets Tennyson, Browning, Matthew Arnold. These poets were philosophic. They were contemplating on the problems, the dilemma of the Victorian age. So they contemplated, but they were not able to have that unification of sensibility which Eliot emphasized. So we have discussed only a few of the critical terms associated with T S Eliot. The remaining ones we will discuss in the next lecture. Thank you.